Hey people, how are you all? Welcome back. Following the surprising success of my two video essays on Good Omens recently, I thought I might try something a little bit similar today with a completely different show. Well, completely-ish. And that show is Netflix's The Sandman. Specifically, I want to talk about the amazing character of Hob Gadling. And whilst I do that, I'm going to draw him getting a hug from Dream, because whilst Dream would absolutely not be caught dead hugging anyone, I was having a rough day when I started this painting, and so hugs were on the brain. And here we are. So I've probably mentioned this before, but the first time I ever watched The Sandman, I went into it knowing only that it was a fantasy show, and that it was based on a work by Neil Gaiman. And the only thing I really knew about Neil Gaiman at the time was that he co-wrote Good Omens, and not that many of his other works are really quite dark and creepy. In other words, I spent my first watch through of this show not really sure if I loved it or hated it, because the characters and world building were just fantastic, but there were certain scenes in this show that were so dark they made me deeply uncomfortable, and I came out of it not really sure what I'd just witnessed, except that I could not stop thinking about that 6th episode, The Sound of Her Wings. Partly because I love the character of Death and I think she's really cool, but mostly because I had Hob Gadling just firmly lodged in my brain. Now, since then I have rewatched the show and discovered that it was much better on a second viewing, and in fact the only scene that's actually too dark for me is the one in the diner with John Dee. You'll know the one I'm talking about if you've seen it, and that the rest of it actually, I don't mind the darker tone and it works really well for the story, of course, and that I'm more than happy to watch it. So now I just skip over that one particularly really dark scene, and I found that I actually really love this show, and I'm really excited about the 2nd season. Also, quick disclaimer that I have not read the comics. I'm partway through listening to Sandman audiobooks, and I'm about halfway through Season of Mists at the minute. But for all intents and purposes, let's assume that this video is mostly based on the show, because Hob Gadling has only appeared once more since that in the comics, and I'm not all caught up yet. So, yeah. So, my favourite thing about this show, Hob Gadling. Now, Hob Gadling is actually only in half of one episode, episode 6, which is not a lot really, especially considering just how popular he seems to have become as a character through so little screen time. And I know he is popular, and it's not just me specifically who's become obsessed with him, because if you look up the Sandman TV on Archive of Our Own, Hob features in the 2nd most number of fanfics, close behind Dream himself, and the next most common character to appear, Lucienne, is in less than half as many as him. Now, these stats are obviously swayed slightly by just how shippable Hob is, and we will be getting back to that at the end of this essay, but there's also so much fan art and just general posting about this guy if you look up the Sandman anywhere, that I kind of wanted to see if I could break down exactly why everyone, myself included, seems to love him so much. It is notable that the character of Death also only appears in half an episode, the same episode in fact, and she's in the front half of that episode, and is also exceedingly popular, but she has a number of things working in her favour that Hob doesn't necessarily. Namely, that she's the main character's sibling. She has an established relationship with Dream, and therefore value to him, which makes us understand that we're supposed to care about her very quickly because Dream cares about her, and as an endless sibling, there's a solid implication that she will be back as a recurring character, and therefore it's okay to get attached to her because we know she'll be returning at a later point in the story. Hob, on the other hand, is starting from scratch as a completely newly introduced character who has just met both the audience and Dream when we first see him. So why exactly is he so easy to get attached to? Particularly considering that he doesn't know any of the other characters either. Death at least knows Desire, and it's kind of understood that she knows of characters like Lucifer and other elements of the story that have been introduced. Hob has nothing to do with any of them other than Dream, and to a significantly lesser extent, Death. Now, I do have my own biases here. I have a bit of a habit of getting attached to bisexual coded characters who are cleverer than they look and surprisingly competent at their job but often get belittled or ignored because they're surrounded by other superhuman characters of some description who make them seem painfully small and human in comparison. I don't entirely know what it says about me that I get so attached to that kind of character, but I can think of at least 3 different ones, including Hob, who fit that description, all of whom I've gotten exceedingly attached to and decided to protect at all costs. But with Hob, there's a lot more than just these surface observations at play, and obviously that type of character doesn't appeal to everyone. And these deeper elements of his personality and character affect both his character and the story and his role in it, and so I want to dig into some of those. The first thing that makes everybody love Hob is probably the format of that first half an episode, in which we see him in snapshots of history. This allows us to learn a massive amount about who he is, his history, and how he's changed and grown over time in a very small amount of screen time. It's easier to get attached because it doesn't feel like he's hiding too many secrets from us. We can trust his intentions and his surface character because we've seen snippets of who he is underneath that across all the centuries, and we're familiar with that more hidden version of himself. He's unlikely to betray Dream at this point because he's had 600 years to do it, and he's still not even seemed to come close. It's a technique that works really well when you have immortal characters, actually, as evidenced in Good Omen episode 3 Cold Open from season 1, which is kind of infamous as being the fandom's favourite bit of that season, and similarly shows two characters and how their relationship has developed over the millennia. Plus, we get to see the characters in lots of different historical fashions, which is always loads of fun and great for me as an artist, so yay. But this jumping through time thing is only possible because of who Hob is as an immortal character, and a surprisingly unique one at that. And I suspect that uniqueness of who he is and how he exists contributes massively to how popular he's become. Now, if you've never watched the overly sarcastic productions Trope Talk on Immortality, I'd highly recommend it. Their entire YouTube channel is amazing, but I'm going to paraphrase some of it here while I discuss what kind of immortal Hob actually is, because I think they kind of lay it out really well. Because in most stories with immortal characters, you have one of a few different types of immortals. You have the god type of immortals who were never human to begin with, and to whom mortality is such a distant concept that they don't respond to immortality in a predictably human way. The Endless siblings would probably all fit into this category, because whilst they do occasionally dip into thoughts on the fleeting lives of human beings, none of them ever behave as if they wish they could be mortal or human, except possibly Destruction, who we haven't met yet, so I'm just gonna shelve him. Because the idea is simply inconceivable to them. They've never been mortal, they have no longing for mortality, and immortality isn't as crushing to them as it might be for a human character. Then, of course, you have immortal beings that aren't human, but do live on Earth among humans. I'm thinking about vampires, warlocks, undead creatures, that sort of thing. Anything that lives forever, but also has powers or peculiar conditions to their eternal life that kind of makes them more than human in some way. These ones are often also conditionally immortal, in that they don't age or get sick, but there is usually some way to kill them if you really want to. Stake through the heart, for instance. How they behave tends to depend on how many of them there are. If there's plenty of them, then they tend to be mostly sane, because whilst it's sad that the humans around them keep dying, they still have other immortal friends who won't die that they can bond with and, socialise with, etc. Or sometimes there's enough of them that they can basically just ignore humanity altogether and kind of pretend they don't notice them. You often find stories where you've got a massive group of vampires and then one vampire gets attached to a human, and that's kind of seen as a peculiarity of that particular character, and they explore the relationship with humanity through that lens. However, if they're mostly alone, then they do tend to wind up much more miserable, hating their immortality, trying to reverse it, or they go insane and develop a straight-up god complex in a lot of cases. However, because they're inhuman in some way, there are usually at least another few immortals around of a similar nature that can potentially pull them out of this funk, or try to change their minds, or just straight up kill them if they have gone into the god complex zone and are causing real problems for the greater human community. These tend to be the kind that show up most in fiction because they're a really fun vessel to explore the meaning of humanity and the weight of grief and all that good stuff, as well as what it is that makes us human and whether having certain powers or having to drink blood take away from that experience. Then finally, we have the human immortals, or more accurately, the humans who want to be immortals and either fail to achieve immortality or end up regretting immortality near instantly once they have it. Most of these characters are written as cautionary tales and end up giving up on their goal to become immortal, or they attain it but there's some kind of catch, like they're immortal now but they age until they're nothing but a pile of bones, and it's essentially a warning against the hubris of humanity and daring to believe they could be near the gods. There's hundreds of these tales all over the place. The few that don't suffer that fate often end up regretting it for other reasons, because they're much more likely to become an immortal alone if they're a human who has become immortal as opposed to some kind of magical creature. exactly like Hob Gadling, who is the only immortal being on Earth, aside from Mad Hetty and potentially a couple of other immortal characters that are vaguely referenced in the comics, but he's pretty much by himself, and he also has no way to contact Dream or any of the other Endless, who he doesn't actually know exist. And so is effectively isolated, he is completely alone. And the majority of characters in this category then end up regretting their immortality when they face the crushing grief and despair that comes with outliving every person you've ever known and loved, which usually triggers, once again, an existential crisis of some kind that will either give you severe depression or a god complex again. And Hob Gadling is special because he is such a fun twist on this kind of character. Not only does he not immediately get struck down for the hubris of demanding immortality, but when he first meets Dream himself, the Prince of Stories is certain Hob won't last 100 years of eternal life before begging for death, because how could any human actually want an eternity on this earth? And I suspect there's an element of being the Prince of Stories means that Dream has seen these stories play out and he knows how it ends. But the thing is, he's just so wrong. Hob adores life and he revels in it, and whilst over the course of 600 years we see him grappling with and figuring out his purpose as immortal, whether or not he deserves it, and the soul-crushing grief of outliving his own son, that love of life never dies. He feels all the loneliness and isolation that you see in other immortal characters of his type. It's really evident in the way that he clings to Dream as his one piece of stability that is never going to fade. But that loneliness never makes him want to stop loving and living. He's painfully optimistic and determined in a way that's really beautiful to see in an age where we're suffering from a worldwide mental health crisis, I'm not going to lie. And this optimism of his isn't treated by the narrative as if it's a mistake. The narrative never tries to paint him as naive or foolish for having this hope, despite being a dark fantasy story. In fact, all he's been through instead makes us want to believe in him that the world is good and that there is hope, because we can see how much he's suffered and how much this story has put him through in his 600 years, but he still believes in the good in the world. Now, when I first watched this show, Hob actually reminded me of another character that I want to bring up now as a point of comparison. And that's Captain Jack Harkness from Torchwood and Doctor Who. You don't have to have seen it or known who the character is for this to make sense. Hopefully, I'm going to try to explain to the best of my ability. Because on the surface, these two characters are very similar. They both come from backgrounds where they've lost a lot of people and the world has generally not been too great to them. They both get made immortal without their knowledge and then left to figure out that fact on their own. And they both get abandoned and dismissed by a companion of the one who made them immortal, who knew about their immortality and refused to tell them, and who they definitely have a little bit of a crush on. But unlike Hob, Jack Harkness is kind of miserable, particularly in Torchwood. If you've seen him in Doctor Who, he's much more light-hearted because it is a kids' media. But Torchwood is like the edgier spin-off, and Jack's immortality is something that comes up a lot, and he is really struggling with it. He's constantly looking for ways to undo his immortality and to become a mortal man again, and whilst he does begin to accept that he's stuck with it and he ought to just make the most of life, he has several stretches of time where he feels completely hopeless and only keeps going because he doesn't really have a choice. And all of this happens within the first 200 years, as opposed to the 600 that Hob Gadling survives. So the question is, what's the difference? Well, the thing about Hob that makes him particularly unique is his immortality is a choice. Not only did he ask for it in the first place, but he has the option to reverse it at any time he wants to, and he keeps choosing not to. Jack Harkness, on the other hand, is stuck as an immortal and he cannot change that. In fact, there is a moment in season 4 of Torchwood where Jack temporarily does become immortal through plot shenanigans that make absolutely no sense to me to this day. And whilst he's rather pleased at the thought of being mortal again, the minute his life's in danger it becomes very clear that he does not want to die, at least not yet. Which is interesting, because I think when you then compare that to Hob, it does become evident that Hob has an inherent optimism to him, and a delight in the world around him. But I think one of the most unique things about him is that he has that choice and the ability to choose to stop living, which is one of the things that keeps him going during the dark times, because he knows the world can get better and be better. And if it doesn't, he always has that way out. He can choose to live because he knows that if it becomes too much, he could choose to die. But he's never going to, because you might as well wait it out another 20 years, another 30 years, another 100 years, just to see if the world improves. And sure, if the sun explodes one day, he might finally give up, but he doesn't have to because he knows he can keep going, and if things do just keep getting worse and worse and worse, he could give up if he wanted to. But he won't. Hobbs' optimism and hope, though, is also a huge part of why the character is so brilliant. As I said, it's lovely to see a character of this type, particularly in the dark fantasy genre, but also just in general in this day and age, when there is a tendency towards writing more morally grey characters, and Hobbs certainly is morally grey, but there's a genre of character these days who are just very cynical about the world around them, and it's very much a case of everything is dark and depressing, but I keep going because, well, I'm really supposed to. He is a literal ray of sunshine in what is realistically quite a dark world. Like I said, this is the dark fantasy genre, and a lot of things in this genre, not everything, I will admit, I'm learning that, but a lot of things in this genre put me off specifically because it's a case of the characters just hating their own existences for, like, however many pages. And Hobbs doesn't. Whilst the Sandman world isn't one of complete darkness where everything is miserable everywhere, the general tone of the story is pretty dark, with people often doing really horrible things to each other in exchange for power, albeit often under the influence of various magical artifacts that they really shouldn't have had in the first place. And Hobbs is something bright and hopeful in all that dark, in a way that I think really reflects one of the main themes of the story, that there is good in humanity and that they are capable of change. The idea that humanity is good at its core comes up constantly in this story. For every John Dee and serial convention, the show also shows us people who wanted to be good, who wanted to help, or who were just existing. Like Rose's friends were actively trying to help with no personal gain for themselves, like the people in that poor diner were just going about their lives and living, and whilst none of them were perfect, none of them were inherently terrible people. Despite the fact that what John Dee was trying to do was show that they were such, the way it's presented kind of shows that, yes, there are things about all of us that are dark and we don't want to confront, but that doesn't mean that that is what we are. We can be more of these things that we present to the world, and choosing not to act on those darker things is part of what makes us good. One of the main ideas that Dream, the main character, has to wrestle with within the story as well is learning to forgive humanity and rediscover the good in them after his century-long imprisonment by the Burgesses. In fact, I think this is almost emphasised more in the show compared to the comic by how much more sympathetic Alex Burgess is portrayed at first. We can see that there's good in that kid even if his father strips it away, but we can also sympathise with Dream's need for revenge after what Alex does to him. It's essential to Dream's function that he has compassion for humanity. He was made to serve them, but it's something that he has to very much relearn after his imprisonment. And Hob Gadling personifies this idea, even to the extent that Hob is one of the first people to push Dream to truly change back in 1889, as he is slowly becoming more withdrawn and grumpy over time, to the extent that Desire decides to entrap him to teach him to be better, which, that's a whole nother can of worms. Please don't ever contain your sibling in a giant glass sphere to teach them a lesson. Bad idea, they will not be happy with you. But in 1889, Hob is one of the first people to observe this, and he comments that Dream is lonely, which is of course massively compounded by the next century that Dream spends isolated, whilst the impact of those words sinks in. Which, can I just say, the transformation from 1989 Hobbs' whiskey glass while he's drinking alone in the White Horse, and the way it transforms into the glass sphere where Dream is trapped, is just an exquisite piece of cinema and a beautiful visual, and I love it. Hob, despite his short screen time, has such a profound impact on Dream and the way in which he starts to change himself. Hob sees the good in the world so easily that Dream can barely understand it. But even Hob isn't perfect, which almost helps. He participated in the slave trade. He is responsible for unimaginable amounts of suffering and pain, but he learns from those mistakes and he never stops trying to be better. He shows that human beings, even if they do horrible, horrible things, can learn. Not all of them, not all the time, but given enough time, they are capable of being better. However, more than just being the thematic personification of the point of the entire story, this half of an episode also does a surprising amount to get the audience invested in Hobbs' relationship with Dream. Starting with the fact that when Dream is feeling lost and adrift with no purpose, his sister, the person who seemingly knows him best in the world and who he gets on best with, immediately sends him to Hob, which establishes Hob instantly as a good person for Dream to be around and a person who can help him. Hob also has a very unique position as Dream's only real friend. Hob is in fact the only person Dream seems to tolerate who isn't his sibling or family member, or one of his creations or subjects. Hob is the only person Dream can truly turn to who is objective about all of the craziness that's going on around Dream and in the plot, and also the only person with whom Dream can just exist. It's noted in the audiobooks that I've been listening to that of all the siblings, bar possibly Destiny, Dream is the one who takes his job the most seriously. He is essentially a workaholic who is obsessed with doing the right thing and keeping to his rules and doing his job. Which means Hob is one of the few people Dream can truly be himself around, without being a king or being an endless. Even with death, he is constantly reminded of what his job is and what he is supposed to be doing. And this kind of helps make Hob seem more permanent. In another show, Hob Gadling might just be a short story, there to give Dream the character development he needs without actually being important in and of himself. But the way the story is portrayed makes it clear that Hob is important to Dream, and that he's not just going to fade into the background. Even having not read the comics as I had when I first watched this show, I could tell there was a chance that Hob was going to be coming back, that he was going to be relevant to the story. It's not a one-off episode, it's important. And this is something that, almost by coincidence of the TV show being made, 30 years after the comics, is further highlighted in Hob's devotion to Dream. Because in the comics, Dream escapes the fishbowl just in time to make it to his 1989 meeting with Hob, as opposed to the show where he is exceedingly late by 33 years. Which means we get to see that not only did Hob wait 33 additional years for Dream after their fight, never quite giving up hope in him, but Dream also chose to go find Hob because he didn't want Hob to believe he'd actually been forsaken and that they weren't friends. If he'd shown up in 1989, they could have brushed it all under the rug, which they sort of do in the comics. They kind of just go, you're forgiven, end of story. But showing up late means Dream admitting he actually made a mistake, if only in action. Then finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Dreamling ship. This ship has probably come about in part because this is a Neil Gaiman work, and whether intentionally or not, that man has managed to cultivate an exceedingly queer fanbase who are always going to say yes please to century-long slow burn. But also I believe it's in part come around because of how convenient it is. Like I said before, Hob is one of the only people Dream tolerates who isn't family or a creation or servant of some kind. And whilst being an anthropomorphic personification means that it's open to interpretation whether Dream truly has any blood relatives, it's definitely iffy territory, making Hob the least complicated option by about 1,000,000 miles. There is also, I suppose, Joanna Constantine, who Dream doesn't hate, but she's very clearly a lesbian and also has nearly as many commitment issues as Dream himself does, so I'm just gonna, put her in a little extra box on the side as, kind of gay best friend territory, if you know what I mean. Most of the main characters are also Dream's family or creation too, so not only is Hob pretty much the best shipping option for Dream, but Dream and Hob is one of the only really strong ships in this fandom. There aren't many ships between any of the other characters because they're literally all related to each other. I would like to clarify, of course, if you have other ships in the Sandman universe, that's super cool and really good for you, but for me, this is kind of how it appears. And just because Hob is the only non-messy option, really, here, doesn't mean that there isn't a lot to support this ship anyway. The writer room for the Sandman was full of queer people, who have confirmed in a couple of interviews that whilst nothing is explicit between these two characters, the potential romantic undertones to their conversation, particularly from 1789 onwards, were written in intentionally. Which, after decades of various writers telling the queer community that we're imagining things, it's so lovely to hear it said, yes, we did this on purpose. It's also just very clear that platonic, or romantic, or otherwise, these two characters really care about each other. Hob in the way that he waited 133 years for Dream after their fight and built him an entire pub, but also from Dream's side in the way that he worries about Hob getting hurt or captured, and freaks out when it is suggested that he might care for Hob's companionship. If he was truly indifferent to Hob, the implication that he might care about him wouldn't have shaken him at all. And it's also definitely notable the way Dream smiles when he sees Hob in the present day. It's by no means the only time Dream smiles in the series, but his smiles are rare, and usually it's a self-confident smirk of some kind, when he knows something that somebody else doesn't or he's just been proven right. In the very short scene in the new inn, Hob gets 2 smiles in quick succession, just for existing and because Dream is happy to see him, which is frankly adorable. I feel like it's a sign that Dream lets his guard down around Hob, something he at most maybe does around his sister or Lucienne, but even then you can still see he's focused on the pressure of his job and his purpose, whereas with Hob that might be the closest he ever gets to just truly existing. Not to mention the fact that Death, not Dream, is responsible for Hob's immortality, which neatly circumvents the potential power imbalance that might arise from Dream having the ability to revoke said immortality if they got into a fight. There's also just the immense cuteness of the grumpy one being soft for the sunshine one, in which Dream is literally the grumpiest grumpy one to ever exist, and Hob, as we've already established, is sunshiny beyond all reason. Of course, Dream does have a romantic back catalogue about 100 pages long, but from what I can tell, almost all of those relationships have ended in complete disaster, and whilst I am not immune to the appeal of Dream and Calliope and Hob altogether, he can barely talk to her about their son, even after he's decided he does still care about her enough to save her. So, how much he truly belongs with any of those past lovers is up for debate. To conclude, I think people really love Hob Gadling, both his beautiful uniqueness and the hope that he personifies that I think a lot of us really need, and that is reflected in Dream's own need for that hope. For his half an hour of television, Hob is incredibly well developed and multifaceted. There's so much history to be explored that it's really easy to get attached and to think about what he was doing during those gaps we don't see, and how the different things that we know about him might have affected him in the long term. There's just so much you can explore, and it's really easy to grow attached to him. He's one of my favourite characters in a long while, I think. So yeah. I really hope you enjoyed this video and the art to go with it. If you did, I would love for you to leave a comment. I do my best to respond to all of them because they always make my day. I've been really loving doing these video essay style videos recently, so if you have other topics, films, shows, or characters that you want to hear about, please just let me know and I'll see if I can find time to do those as well. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you all soon. Bye!